Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for NAC's At Home program today. My name is Dawn Lilly. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical, dance, and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Tonight's journey into Yiddish theater is sponsored by the Round Table and the Theater Committee. Questions about our journey can be submitted into the question box, and we hope you will. And Linda Selman, chair of the Theater Committee, will handle them at the end. Motl Didner is Associate Director of the National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene, located in New York City. He has had a distinguished career as a theater director, and he has been nominated and won many awards. Among them, a Drama Desk, Outer Critics Circle, and Lucille Lortel for Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish on Broadway, for which he was associate director with Joel Gray. Mr. Didner was also a translation fellow with the Yiddish Book Center and teaches Yiddish language courses in his own unique way. It's a pleasure to present him.
Much. Thank you to Dawn and to Linda and to Mitch and everyone at the National Arts Club for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with you here tonight. I hope everybody is healthy and well and staying warm. As Dawn mentioned, I am the Associate Artistic Director of the National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene. I'm coming up on 19 years with the company, and it's been really an amazing journey seeing us grow from a somewhat obscure small theater to a mainstay of off-Broadway with a lot of critical recognition for our work. And so we'll talk a little bit about that journey. But I want to start just with a quick overview of what Yiddish is, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. Yiddish is a composite language, sort of like a layer cake of languages that tell the story of the Jewish journey from the ancient Middle East to Eastern Europe, and from there to America and Australia and really South America, all throughout the world in the Jewish diaspora. The ancient Israelites, of course, spoke pure Hebrew. This was the biblical language, and that was up until about the 6th century BCE, at the time of the Babylonian exile, when large portions of the Jewish population were actually physically removed from the ancient homeland and brought to Babylon, present-day Iraq. And there they started speaking Aramaic as their lingua franca. The captivity only lasted about 60 years. The Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians. The Jewish people were allowed to return. And they actually kept Aramaic as their daily language, with Hebrew reserved as the language of prayer and study. But the Aramaic they were speaking did have a bit of Hebrew mixed in with it, especially for religious concepts that didn't have an equivalent word in Aramaic. So Shabbat or Shabbos stayed in its form. That lasted until about the 1st century of the current era, when following the 2 uprisings against the Roman occupation of ancient Judea, hundreds of thousands of Jews were brought as slaves to the Roman Empire. These were defeated warriors. And so they began speaking Latin as their daily language, but it was mixed with Aramaic and Hebrew. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, many of these Jews migrated north into the Rhine Valley in the areas between present-day France and Germany, and they were speaking sort of a combination of Old French and Middle High German mixed in with some words from Latin and Hebrew and Aramaic. In about the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a mass migration in response. Jews were being persecuted throughout what was then the Holy Roman Empire during the time of the Crusades, and were offered shelter in Poland. So Jews were migrating eastward, and there the language that they were speaking started to take on some Slavic elements, some Slavic vocabulary and grammatical structures. And so you start to really see the formation of what we now call Yiddish. This language, of course, was carried to the New World with immigration, and really was the daily spoken language up until World War II. Of course, we know in Europe what happened to the majority of the Yiddish speakers, and here in America and other countries in diaspora, assimilation reduced the number of Yiddish speakers, but it never fully went away. And fortunately, we're seeing that it is on a very big growth trend over the last several decades. And during the time of the pandemic, there's this huge trend of people wanting to learn Yiddish. So let's take a look at the Yiddish theater. Yiddish theater was actually not part of the Jewish culture until the mid-19th century. Well, I'll back up a little bit. There was a form of Yiddish theater that dates back to about the 16th century, but the reason for that is that theater in antiquity was associated with Greek and Roman worship. The Greek and Roman plays told the story, not only told the stories of the gods, but actually depicted them in person on stage. And of course, Jewish law prohibits graven images, any depiction of God and even other biblical figures. So it was considered treif. It was not fitting for Jews. But things sort of changed. I'm going to share my screen here. We've got some illustrations for you. Things started to change around the time of the Renaissance. This is a woodcut of a Purim spiel. This one is from Prague, but we find that that there are Purim spiels going back to the 16th century in Venice. Jews lived in Venice, literally in the ghetto. That's where the term comes from. It was an area of the city that was actually walled in. It's an island where the Jews could, during the day, they could go out of the ghetto in order to conduct their trade, and then at night they were physically locked in. But if you've ever been to Venice, you know that this isn't some sort of remote island. This is one of the very many islands that make up the city of Venice, and Jews were very well aware of what was going on among their Christian neighbors. Purim is celebrated usually in late February to early March, depending on the year, but it comes around the same time of the year as the Christian Carnival or Mardi Gras, which is the beginning of the Christian holy season and was historically celebrated with big public celebrations, parades. This was the beginning of the Christian theater season on the pageant wagons, the miracle and the mystery plays. And so the Jews figured, well, we celebrate Purim in a similar way with revelry and drinking and feasting and parades and music, and the rules are a little bit relaxed. So this was the beginning of the of Yiddish theater. There was no professional Yiddish theater. There were no theater buildings. What there were groups of friends, perhaps from the Tailors Guild or the Shoemakers Guild, or from went to the same synagogue, and they would put on these little 10 to 15 minute plays. They didn't all tell the story of the Book of Esther. Many of them told other biblical stories. One of the most popular ones is the selling of Joseph into slavery by his brothers. So if you know a musical that tells a similar story, it actually has 500 years of theatrical precedence. So these little groups of friends doing their 10 to 15 minute plays would go from house to house on Purim Day, where the feasts were taking place. In exchange, they would get some treats or maybe a little bit of money. If it sounds to you a little bit like Christmas caroling, it's a very, very similar thing. There is a very famous Yiddish rhyme, Heint is Purim, morgen is ois, git unser Groschen und warft unser Reus, which translates to, today is Purim, tomorrow it's over, so give us a little money and throw us out into the streets. And then they would proceed down to the next house. This was the entirety of Yiddish theater for about 300 years. It was performed only the one day of the year. Until the mid-19th century, when this fellow, whose name is Avram Goldfaden, who came out of the Haskalah movement, that's the Jewish Enlightenment, he came from a town in present-day Ukraine, but he moved to the neighboring nation of Romania, which had a little bit more liberal views towards Jewish culture at that particular time. He was just in the right place at the right time. And he was part of this movement called the Brode Singers, the singers from this that started in the city of Brody. And they were sort of like troubadours. They would go to wine gardens and beer halls, and they would sing these sort of like epic narrative songs. And so that's what he came out of. But he was a very big fan of the Viennese operetta, which was very popular at that time all over Europe, not just in Vienna, but that's where it began and took its name. And he decided that he was going to make this kosher. He was going to use this medium to tell Jewish stories in a way that were palatable to a Jewish audience in a Jewish language. So he was in the city of Iași, Romania, and he started the very first professional Yiddish theater troupe. He was a very prolific writer. In his 30-year career, he penned about 50 Yiddish operettas, musicals, and plays. He produced and directed them, and what happened, this was about the 1870s, or beginning in the 1870s, and very quickly his company members were splintering off. Sometimes they were ripping off his plays. There were very few copyright laws in effect at that time. Then maybe they would change the title or some of the character names, and they would start their own companies. And they very quickly spread out all throughout Eastern Europe, and not only in the big cities, even in the small towns. There were many traveling troupes, and it just took off like wildfire. Some of the stars that came out of this early Yiddish theater include, this is Regina Prager. You'll see that she's on a cover of a piece of sheet music here. A lot of the songs that we know from that early period were from her memory. She basically dictated the songs to music copyists who would then publish it, because these early works were never intended for publication. So in much the same way that Shakespeare's works were often preserved by the actors having saved their roles and then being reassembled. This is Rudolf Schildkraut. He was a crossover star, started from the Yiddish theater. He eventually went on to do films as well, mostly in Germany in the pre-war period. This gentleman, whose name is Boris Tomaszewski, many of you probably know who he is. He's the grandfather of Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor of Boston Pops, and he essentially brought Yiddish theater to America. He was a 14-year-old immigrant from Ukraine. He had never seen theater before. He had a little musical training singing in his synagogue's choir, and was working in a cigarette factory, a sweatshop in New York. And he would hear his fellow coworkers singing these Yiddish theater songs that they remembered having seen before coming to America. And the most popular songs that they would sing were from an operetta called the Kishevmacherin, or the Sorceress, the Witch. Has a lot of names: the Baba Yachne, the Machshefe, so he decided, remember, he's a 14-year-old boy, and this is in the 1880s. He decides that, so this is at really the beginning of Yiddish immigration. He decides he's going to bring the Yiddish theater to New York. He's going to produce this. So he convinces a Bowery beer hall owner to stake the production. They're going to bring over a core of actors from London who are where the Yiddish theater had already been established. He was going to bring them over to New York. They would play the lead roles, and then he would fill the rest of the roles in with locals, including himself. But the German Jewish community, which had been very well established already in America at that point, they had immigrated about 50, 60 years earlier, felt that assimilation and learning English and abandoning the old country ways was the best course of action for Jews to thrive in America. So they did not want Yiddish culture to take anchor here. So the story goes that they bribed the soubrette to fake a sore throat and not go on that night. There's a couple different versions of the legend. One of them has it that the 14-year-old Tomaszewski told the orchestra to just start playing the overture. He was going to go to the actress's apartment and convince her to come and perform, and that he would pay her whatever the Germans were paying her. One version of the story goes that she was not going to come down no matter what, so he put on the dress and he went on in the soubrette role. One version has it that he did convince her, but by the time they got to the theater, the orchestra had been playing the overture over and over and over again, and the audience got tired of waiting and they all went home. Whatever version of the story is true, it was not a smash success right away. They did try again later. It did work out the second time. And within about 10 years, Yiddish theater was taking off in America as it was everywhere else. And of course, there was a big star system here. This, by the way, this is a picture not of that production from the 1880s, but from around 1910, but of the same play, the Kishevmacherin, of the Sorcerer. So here, the story is sort of a fairy tale cross between Cinderella and Snow White. Here you can see the witch on the right side of the screen. You see the witch's apprentices stirring the cauldron in the center, which the set is very crude. And on the left, you have your young heroine, your Snow White type character. Other stars of the system, Maury Schwartz was one of the impresarios. He owned the theater, produced, directed, starred. He went on to star in Yiddish films as well. He had one of the longest careers. I'll touch back on him later. This is Jacob P. Adler, the patriarch of the Adler clan, which of course includes Stella Adler, who began her career in the Yiddish theater and went on to establish the Stella Adler Conservatory. Molly Picon and Menashe Skolnick, who was a big crossover star, and Jenny Goldstein, who is famous for her tear-jerking renditions of songs such as A Yiddish Mame. And the audiences just loved these people. Molly Picon, of course, had a career that stretched well into the 1980s. She played Yenta in the film version of Fiddler on the Roof, but she made several television appearances, such as in Car 54, Where Are You? And Gomer Pyle, and even into the 80s in a show called The Facts of Life. So they were really big, enduring stars. Some of the best writers were writing for the Yiddish theater. Not necessarily playwrights, but who did cross over. Some of them were playwrights. The gentleman on the top left is Jacob Gordon. He wrote a very famous piece called Grüne Felder, Green Fields. He also wrote the Jewish King Lear. We have I.L. or Yud Lamed Peretz in the middle. He was a poet and a novelist who also dabbled in the theater. The gentleman on the top right, of course, is Sholem Aleichem. He wrote for the theater as well. He actually had not nearly as much success as he did as a short story writer. He tended to adapt his own stories for the stage and didn't really ever learn the craft. And unfortunately, a lot of his productions bombed. But after his death in 1916, the works were later adapted to very great success, including the play of Tevye, which preceded Fiddler on the Roof. On the bottom, we've got Sholem Ansky, S. Ansky, who wrote the very famous play The Dybbuk. And on the bottom right is Sholem Asch, who wrote God of Vengeance. Many of you probably saw Indecent on Broadway a few years ago, which tells the story of that scandalous play set in a brothel. Second Avenue, between Houston and 14th, was the Yiddish Broadway. There were, at its height around 1920, there were 14 permanent theaters lining Second Avenue. Some of them were huge. This one, Kessler's Second Avenue Theater, was a 2,000-seat house, and they packed the audiences in, 8 performances a day. There were smaller theaters as well. If any of you know where the Orpheum is, where Stomp has been playing for the last several decades, that had been a Yiddish theater at one point, of a smaller house, about 99 seats. And there were Yiddish theaters as well in the Bronx and in Brooklyn, also some very, very big houses there. It really provided a lot of relief for the immigrants. It was, this was at a time before television, before even radio. This was their main form of entertainment. They were living very difficult lives, crowded into sweatshops and tenements on the Lower East Side. And the theater was a place where they could connect, socialize, have some leisure. It wasn't terribly expensive, and the stories really supported their journey. This is one of the bigger theaters, the Yiddish theaters on Second Avenue. The building is still there. This was Maurice Schwartz's Yiddish Art Theater at one point, or initially, I should say. And this is what it looks like today. It's the movie theater that's not too far from the National Arts Club. It's on 2nd Avenue and 11th Street. And it's cut up now to be a multiplex, but there's a couple indicators of its original life. If you look on the lower hand right side under the marquee, you can't really see it in this picture, but there is a cornerstone there with the date in Hebrew letters, the year that the building was constructed. And if you happen to be seeing a movie from one of the upstairs smaller theaters where the balcony used to be, and you look up at the light fixtures, you will see Stars of David up there. So the Yiddish plays really were reflecting the lives and the stories of the people who were going to see them. This is an early Yiddish theater poster from around 1910. The title of the play is called A Gruß von der Heim, Greetings from Home. And you see, of course, in the center is the Statue of Liberty. There's a ship passing by. And then in the lower half, on the left side, you see immigrants stepping off the ship. They're dressed as they would be dressed traditionally in the old country. And on the right side, you see their relatives waiting to greet them, dressed as very high-class, wealthy Americans. You'll notice one very important thing here. Almost everything on this poster is written in Yiddish, using the Hebrew alphabet as it's traditionally written, except for some information at the top, the name of the theater and the location. We fast forward one generation. So this is from around 1910. Here's a poster from the 1930s for Moshiach kommt, the Messiah comes. Here you'll see that almost everything on the poster is written in English. Even the title is transliterated using the Latin alphabet. It is only in the lower left-hand corner that you see the Yiddish title in written in Hebrew letters, secondary to the Latin letters. Very big difference. One of the reasons why they came to the Yiddish theater and it was such an emotional connection was it was really reflecting their own stories. So earlier on, the Yiddish theater was telling stories of the immigrants, as you saw in that poster. One of the things that it really filled in for them was that connection to the old country and the old life. So many Jews, when they first immigrated to America, secularized very quickly. They stopped going to synagogue. They stopped a lot of the religious practices. And in almost every single one of these plays, at some point, there is a religious ceremony included within the storytelling. It could be an entire kol nidre, or a bar mitzvah, or a wedding, or a kiddush on Shabbos. It was quite a phenomenon that kept them grounded and in that connection. And then we see here a generation later, these are telling American stories. This is the Mashiach Kumt is about a huckster who's like a vaudeville promoter who is going to declare that he's found the Messiah, and of course he's monetizing all of this. But that's the kind of story that one would expect from that time. In 1915, there was a group of amateur theater lovers who formed a drama club called the Freie Yiddische Folksbiene that eventually became the Folksbiene, the National Yiddish Theater. But it means the Freie Yiddische Folksbiene means the Free Jewish People's Stage. This was a drama club that we actually formed from two earlier existing drama clubs who merged under the auspices of the Workers' Circle, the Arbeiter Ring. They were branch 555, and their mission was to produce literary plays of high social value. And in fact, the very first play that they produced was Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People in Yiddish translation. Why produce it in Yiddish? Well, why produce it in English? The play was written in Norwegian because they were serving an immigrant audience for whom Yiddish was their primary language. And the play had the social values that they were looking to communicate. These were working people. These were people who worked their days mostly, in the needle trade or other sorts of sweatshops. And then in the evenings and the weekends, they would rehearse and perform these plays. And you can see the values. This is a play called Province. Look at how many people are depicted on the poster. They were trying to really be egalitarian and inclusive. These were all volunteers. They were not being paid for their labor. Here's a picture of one of their earlier productions. You see the set's very crude. It's two-dimensional. These are A-frame ladders with some sort of flats in front of them. And you see how big and inclusive the cast is. And we're going to get back to that, to the story of the Folkspina. We're going to jump forward in time a little bit here. Okay, let's go back to Europe. We've been talking about America for a while. In Europe, we're now in the interwar period, and the Yiddish theater is following the same trajectory as the European theater in terms of expressionism. This is a production of The Golem by H. Levick, very famous play. This is a production by the Vilna Truppe, the Vilna troupe, who began in what's now Vilnius, Lithuania. At that time, it was Poland. There were actually several companies that splintered off, all performing under the name Vilna Truppe, who toured the world. In the interwar period in the early Soviet Union, there was a state-sponsored Moscow State Jewish Art Theater, the Goset, which was very high level. The directors were trained by Stanislavski, and the set and the costume design, this is a production of a work by Sholem Aleichem. Marc Chagall designed their sets and their costumes. This was in the period when he returned to the Soviet Union after spending several years in Paris, where he would return later. it's just phenomenal to think of an artist of the caliber of Marc Chagall designing theatrical sets and costumes. Also in the interwar period, this is in Poland, there was a very popular theatrical form called Kleinkunst, little art theater. These were cabaret performances, very political, very sharp, very critical of what was going on in Jewish society, as well as the rising anti-Semitism, both within Poland and from neighboring Germany. Both these are performers named Gigan and Schumacher. They're sort of like the Yiddish Abbott and Costello, a little bit sharper, but both of them survived the war. They actually escaped into the Soviet Union and spent years in Siberia. And then after the war, they returned. There's a great documentary called Unser Kinder, Our Children, where they've returned to Poland and are trying to engage with the with orphaned children survivors. Meanwhile, in the same period in the 1930s, we're now kind of later in the 1930s, there's this burgeoning Yiddish cinema movement underway. Molly Picon starred in several of these. Many of them were musicals, Yidel mit dem Fiddle, Mamele. And what was remarkable about some of these, they were filmed in Poland. So Molly Picon and most of the stars went from America to Poland to film these movies. But when you watch them, and you can see many of them through the Jewish Film Center out of Brandeis University, the extras are not actors. They're real Jewish people living in Poland in 1938 and 1939 when they filmed these, really right up until the outbreak of the war. So it's quite a document of Jewish life before the war. Meanwhile, during the war, there were Yiddish theaters that persisted all throughout Eastern Europe, in the ghettos, in the concentration camps. It was just a way for Jews to feel some semblance of normalcy. They weren't theaters in the sense we think of today. They were not well equipped, of course. They didn't, they were people performing what they knew from memory in many cases, little bits and pieces, just whatever they could do to kind of keep spirits up. But this poster I want to point out, it's called Der Ness in Ghetto, The Miracle of the Warsaw Ghetto. This was a play written by H. Levick, who wrote The Golem. It was written and performed in the fall of 1944 in New York, while the war was still going on. It was 18 months after the actual Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It's not 100% historically accurate, of course, because all the facts weren't known, but it's remarkable how much was known. They specifically mention in this play that the Jewish population of the Warsaw Ghetto was being liquidated in a place called Treblinka. So when people tell you, well, they didn't really know, that's why they didn't bomb the train lines, etc. If a playwright living in New York knew very specifically the name of the place where the liquidation was happening, it's a good bet that the authorities knew as well. After the war, there was a lot of attention on the new state of Israel in 1948. But what was interesting, this is a musical review called Sing Yisrael Sing, Sing Israel Sing. What was interesting, though, at that time, there was a lot of hostility in Israel towards the Yiddish language, and Yiddish productions couldn't originate there. But touring productions from America, such as this one, could come to Israel. That would change a couple decades later. In 1965, which is 1 year after the Broadway opening of Fiddler on the Roof, there was a Yiddish production. It was preceded by a Hebrew language production, and some of the actors, including Shraga Friedman, who was in that Hebrew company, translated it into Yiddish. It didn't run for very long, but it did produce this cast album, which became very well known throughout the Yiddish-speaking world. There would not be an American production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish until our production in 2018, and I'll get to that later. The next year, the Megillah of Itzik Manger. This was a new musical composed by Dov Seltzer, an Israel prize-winning composer. A musical setting for the poetry cycle of Itzik Manger, a Yiddish poet from Poland who had survived the war as well, was living in Israel at this time. But the poetry cycle was written in 1937. It was very successful, toured the world, and ended up on Broadway in 1968. That was the last fully Yiddish production to be on Broadway. There were some bilingual productions, which I'll get to shortly. The Folksbiene, meanwhile, was chugging along, while the other commercial Yiddish theaters were closing in the post-war period because the population had not only had dwindled, but was also moving out of the Lower East Side. The commercial theaters were pretty much done by the late 1960s, but the Folksbiene was still going because it was a nonprofit theater. And it started to become what was called semi-professional, as the actors who were displaced, who lost their jobs in the commercial Yiddish theaters, were finding homes in the at the Folksbiene. So you might have stars of the show and a director of the show who were paid, and the rest of the company at that point were still amateurs. But that would start to change. The company was professionalizing. Here is a picture from a production in the 90s. This is Tzipora Speisman on the left, who was a survivor who really kept the company going as long as it did. And on the right is Minna Byrne. She had been a popular actress in Poland, and then in America after the war. She and her husband, Ben Bonus, toured the whole country. She was one of the big stars of the Yiddish theater in our time. And it was really their energy, along with some others, Morris Adler and Yossel Mlotek, who kept the company afloat through the workers' circle. But there was a rising generation that was getting ready to bring the company forward. In the 1980s and early 90s, there were some off-Broadway musical reviews of featuring Yiddish songs. These were bilingual. The Golden Land, Those Were the Days, and On Second Avenue. They were created by Zalman Mlotek and Moshe Rosenfeld. Those Were the Days did go on to Broadway and was Tony nominated for its director, Eleanor Risa, who had also appeared earlier in The Golden Land. And it really signaled that Yiddish theater was moving into the future. There were also productions at Town Hall that were created by Mary Soriano, a Romanian-born actress. So the flame was definitely burning. In 1998, there was a generational shift. So the Tzipora Speisman and some of the others who had been running the Folksbiene were well into their 80s at that point. And so Zalman Mlotek and Eleanor Risa took over the company management. It became its own independent organization, separate from the Workers' Circle, became fully professional, started to incorporate translation systems, first with headphones, where somebody would be narrating in English, and then by 2003, we started incorporating projected translation super titles, so it functions like watching a foreign language film. And you can see there's a big difference. Look at this poster, Songs of Paradise, also a new musical setting to the poetry of Itzik Manger. But there's now a younger feel to the company. The actors are younger. There's a more youthful energy. Even the design is more contemporary, for its time. This is Yentl in 2002. There's Eleanor Risa, and you can also see Minna Byrne, the one holding the basket on her lap. This is not the musical, not the Barbra Streisand, but it's a Yiddish translation of the Leah Napoleon play. 2004, On Second Avenue. This is the Folkspina's production of the of what had been that off-Broadway musical review. This really put us on the map. It was the first time that the Folkspina, remember, we've been around since 1915, and it wasn't until 2004 that we ever got a Drama Desk Award nomination. We were always kind of considered, marginal before them, but this really launched us into the off-Broadway community. We also were reaching out to younger generations of performers and audience. This is a show called Kids in Yiddish, which ran for 11 years. We call it Saturday Night Live meets Sesame Street. So it's got something for the parents, something for the children, and it introduces them to Yiddish language and culture. We formed, this is the Folkspina Truppe, the Folkspina Troupe. This was an outreach effort to take shows out of New York City. We've been to communities throughout the United States, and these are all performers in their in their 20s, 30s, early 40s. I'm the one wearing the mask on the right there. And we're all people who learned Yiddish as adults, as a secondary language. I myself grew up in a Jewish home. I had a Jewish education. My grandparents spoke Yiddish, but never taught my parents. So I didn't really learn either. I was in my late 20s when I started studying Yiddish. We went back to the basics, to these classics. So this is our production of the Megillah of Itzik Monger from 2013, which was revived again in 2014. So we go back to our roots with the Purim spiel. This was a critically acclaimed production. In 2015, the following year, we had a huge hit with the Golden Akala, the Golden Bride. We moved to our new home at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It was a 375-seat theater where we've been in a 199-seat theater before. It just allowed us to do more. We could do a show with a big orchestra, with a big cast. And this was a huge hit. It also came back the following year and also was Drama Desk Award nominated. And then, of course, this all laid the groundwork for our production of Fiddler auf dem Dach, Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, directed by Joel Gray, which was a huge coup for us. Joel Gray's father, of course, was the Yiddish, I would say, Yinglish performer Mickey Katz, the humorist and clarinet player and band leader. So Joel grew up around Yiddish and spoke a little bit, but he wasn't fluent. So that was my job as the associate director, was to train the cast, most of which did not come to us speaking Yiddish, to train them to speak Yiddish and to sound as if it was their native language on stage. This, of course, broke all box office records. It ran for 6 months at our home at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and then it moved uptown where it ran for an additional year. We had over 150,000 people attend. Not only did we get nominated for the Drama Desk, but we won the Drama Desk for Best Revival of a Musical. Our Tevye, Stephen Skybell, won the Lucille Lortel Award for Best Actor in a Musical. We won the Out of Critics Circle Award and Off-Broadway League Award and many others. It was really phenomenal. The following year, we produced, again, going back to our roots, this is The Sorceress, the Kishevmacher, and that very first play done in America in 1887. We had to restore the score, which had never been published. Among the research we did, we found these musicians' parts in the YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research. This is from a performance in Odessa around the turn of the century. You see that there was damage to the work. This had been part of the YIVO's library in Vilna before the war, which was seized by the Nazis during the occupation, and it was recovered after the war. Miraculously, it wasn't destroyed and sent to the YIVO in New York, where it's actually, they've just digitized the Vilna collection. So a lot of this can be researched on. I'm going to skip. I have a video clip of that, but I see we're running out of time. So I want to kind of wrap things up. Yiddish theater is still going on in the world. This is the Yiddish theater in Warsaw, the Ida and Esther Rachel Kaminska Theater. This is the Yiddish Spiel. This is out of Tel Aviv. They've been around for about 30 years. This is the State Jewish Theater in Bucharest, Romania. And this is the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater in Montreal. In the pandemic, we've gone online. Of course, like everyone else, we were put out of live performances for the past nearly 2 years. Within a week of the shutdown starting in March of 2020, we began offering online concerts and performances. To date, we have produced about 130 online programs, many of which you can see at nytf.org/on-demand. I'll put that in the chat later. It's just remarkable, the outpouring. We have audiences now, we're reaching all over the world. We've had several 100,000 views of our work. And one of the cornerstones has been this show I created called 15-Minute Yiddish, which came out in May of 2020. People were just asking for Yiddish lessons online. And I've taught Yiddish classes before, but I can't teach more than, say, 20 or 30 people. It becomes unmanageable. So I made this program in little 15-minute chunks, and I figured nobody wants to see me lecture about Yiddish for 15 minutes, so we better make it entertaining. So I created the students in the class, because to me, whenever I teach a class, the students are by far the most interesting element. So we've got Helen Lefkowitz and Wayne and Sophia Frankel, who's very fancy, and Murray Schwartz, the Borscht Belt comedian, and Professor Thomas Shlomo Thompson of the University of Alaska Utqiagvik Judaic Studies Department, and our resident teenager, Scott William Noodleman Krumholtz. And together they make up the core 15-Minute Yiddish. To date, there have been 3 seasons, 15 episodes each. So the finale of season 3 is coming out next Tuesday. So that's 45 episodes, which you can watch all of them both on YouTube and on our website. Just look for 15-Minute Yiddish. Coming up, there was another clip I wanted to show you, but of one of our other productions, but we're running out of time. Upcoming productions: The Garden of the Finzi Continis. This is a brand new opera based on the novel, also the basis for the Oscar award-winning film, The Garden of the Finzi Continis, set in Ferrara, Italy during the war. This was written by Ricky Ian Gordon and Michael Corey. Both of them, by the way, have their debuts at Lincoln Center. Michael Corey with Flying Over Sunset, and Ricky Ian Gordon with Intimate Apparel. So we have very high level creative team on this. This is going to run from January 7th through February 6th. There are only 8 performances. Tickets are available. Just go to our website, nytf.org. And then in the spring, we are presenting the New York debut of what we hope will be the Broadway-bound Harmony. This is a new musical by Barry Manilow and Bruce Sussman. This is the story of the comedian Harmonists. They were a singing group in interwar Germany, 3 Jewish singers, 3 non-Jewish. They were wildly popular. They were the Beatles of their time. They sold out venues all over the world, including Carnegie Hall, made dozens of records and about a dozen films as well. Most of their work was destroyed by the Nazis, who first censored them and then eventually split up the group altogether. Fortunately, all of the members survived, but they never got back together again. So you can hear their story in this new musical. Previews running March 23rd through April 13th, and then it will have a run from April 14th to May 8th. And if anybody would like to join us, we're having a very special gala preview performance on April 12th, at which we will honor Barry Manilow. Go to nytf.org for information about that. so Yiddish theater is really carrying on into the future. We're in probably better shape than we've been in decades. And it's because of the support of our viewers. And we hope that you'll also consider supporting NYTF, National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene. You can contribute through our website. You can, hopefully make us part of your the cultural organizations that you support, so that we can continue doing what we're doing, creating innovative, new, and classic works in the Yiddish language. And we're a little bit over time, but I'd like to open things up now to Q&A.
This was marvelous. I'm so sorry it has to end. So sorry that you can't show your film clips. Everybody's asking for them.
But everybody can go to our website. You can go to nytf.org/on-demand, which I just put into the chat, and you can watch hours and hours and hours of videos. I'm sure we have somewhere around 80 or 90 hours of programming.
Oh, how fabulous. Wonderful, wonderful. So I want you to know that you had an audience from Alaska, North Carolina, London, Montreal, New Hampshire, Boulder, Colorado, Utah, all saying shalom to you and happy to be here and watching you. Everyone is having a marvelous time and they thought your piece was wonderful. Probably could go on and on and on. Some questions, okay? Are your actors only Yiddish speaking? And if they're not, how do you work with them so that they sound like they're truly Yiddish speaking?
Very good question. These days, most of our actors are not Yiddish speaking. They come to us certainly as what we call triple threats, so that they're very, very high level. Many of them are Broadway veterans. And at the auditions, though, unfortunately, that's not quite enough. We're looking for quadruple threats. So we give them a little bit of Yiddish with recordings to prepare. So maybe a 1 page of text. And we see how good their ear is, and if they can take notes, and if they can retain those notes. And those who are very good at absorbing this and can sound in the audition as if they are Yiddish speakers, those are the ones who get cast. It's very competitive. For Fiddler, for example, we had 1,500 submissions for what would eventually be 30 roles. Of the 1,500, we saw 700, and then we had to whittle that down to 30 who made the final cut. So it's highly, highly competitive to get cast in one of our shows. Once they get cast, we prepare recordings and transliterations of the entire script, and they prepare with that prior to the rehearsal starting. And then throughout the rehearsals and throughout preview performances, and even sometimes into the performances themselves, we're still giving little corrections and notes to maintain the quality of the Yiddish.
There was some talk about Joel Grey only knowing a little bit of Yiddish. So what was his technique? I'm sure he knew it from the heart, but yes. What were rehearsals like for him?
So Joel would initially rehearse the scenes in English, with the actors sort of like translating in their heads and paraphrasing. They didn't have to memorize the original English script. Of course, many of them had been in the play several times before and knew it, but so they would perform it in English to make sure that they understood his direction, what he wanted. And then my job was to make sure that when they layered the Yiddish text, which they had already learned, on top of the scene work, that the Yiddish inflections and stresses were matching the intentions that Joel wanted them to express.
Very nice, very nice. And you being an actor, you knew how they would be working. Yes. A lot of improvisation?
Not really improvisation. I would say it was a lot of paraphrasing, but they really stuck very closely to the text as written.
Okay. Now, do you use English titles behind the sets, or do people have to follow in programs?
There was an evolution there. Back in the 70s and early 80s, there were synopses in the printed program, much as there were at the if you had gone to the Metropolitan Opera. In the mid 80s or perhaps early 80s, they started using headsets for translations. Where you would hear somebody translating in your ear into English, and then in the early 2000s, we moved to projecting the titles usually above or to the side of the set, and we present translations both in English and in Russian, because we have so many Russian immigrants who make up our audience. So we wanted to make sure that they're able to follow along as well. There was a question I saw pop up in the chat about the dialect, whether it's Litvak or Galicianer. The theater dialect is actually somewhere in between. They chose to standardize the dialect so that the actors, no matter where they're from, sounded like they were from the same place. So they chose this region called Volyn, which is in present-day Ukraine, but it was geographically located between the area where the Litvaks and the Galicianers were located, and it had some features that were in common with each of those two major dialects. But with Fiddler, we actually chose not to use one of those natural dialects, but something called klal. Klal means standardized. It was an academic dialect that was invented, again, to be somewhere between Litvak and Galicianer, so some features in common with both. And it was a literary dialect, and that was actually the dialect used by the Vilna troupe, and we just decided to stick with that. Although I would say many of our productions, like The Golden Bride, were in that theater dialect.
Yeah, that was the next question. Is there a standard that you use now in other plays?
It's a show by show.
Yes, and depending on what is it chosen?
Well, part of it is depending on the way it was written. There's, you can tell what the author's native dialect was, if it's a musical especially, based on the rhyme scheme, because there are some words that rhyme in one dialect but don't rhyme in another dialect. So,
do you have translators working with you to decipher some of this? Do you have writers?
Mostly it's in-house. Mostly it's myself and my colleague, our literary manager, Sabina Bruckner, who do the translations. But sometimes we have a piece coming up soon. Sabina is doing a fascinating project, the Women's Yiddish Theater series. She's finding, unfortunately, women writers were often shut out of the theater. Their work wasn't produced. So she's been researching and identifying works by women. And we have a project that'll be coming up. It'll be online in the next few months, called All the Windows Face the Sun, by the Yiddish poet Kadia Maladovsky. And we've commissioned a translation for that. That'll sort of match the poetic nature of the work, and that's by Naomi Jones.
Oh, that's very exciting. Tell me, do you get plays written now in Yiddish?
Not many. That's the area that's really kind of lagging behind. We've, in the wave of interest in the Yiddish arts by performers, music came first. Actors and directors from the theater are sort of coming second in that wave, and I think writers are coming up through the ranks now. I think they're in college and in graduate programs, and I think in the next few years we're going to see sort of that same sort of explosive growth among writers. Somebody mentioned the commissioned work of The 10th Man. Eleanor Risa did a translation of Paddy Chayefsky's The 10th Man. It had been scheduled for April of 2020. Of course, that got put off, but that will be rescheduled once we resume post-pandemic.
So where do you find your plays in Yiddish? What reference areas do you go to?
Sure. Well, some of them are the classics of the that are in the canon, and some we find
Where would they
in
find
archives. Oh, well, some of them have been published in anthologies of Yiddish theater. So not all of which have been translated, but many of which have. There are a series of books by Nama Sandro, who has translated several, Joseph Landis. But we find them in the online digital library of the Yiddish Book Center, in the archives of the YIVO. Some of them are just in our own archives. Sometimes we've revived plays that the folkspina has produced in the past.
Do you find that what is your percentage, or I don't know if you even look, non-speaking Yiddish audience and maybe even Gentile audience members coming to see these plays?
I'll answer that in just a second. I want to respond to something that just came up in the chat about harmony. The comedian harmonists, if you go to YouTube and you look up the comedian harmonists, you can see some of the surviving songs, recordings, and film clips. So yes, some of that is out there. To answer your question, the percentage of Yiddish speakers, of course, has been changing greatly over the years. I would estimate now that maybe 10% of our audience are fluent in Yiddish, another maybe 20 or so percent are conversational or very familiar with Yiddish, and the rest speak little to no Yiddish and really rely on the translations. But there's no correlation between the reduction of the percentage of Yiddish speakers and the attendance numbers. The attendance numbers during my 19 years just keep going up and up and up because the quality of the work keeps going up and up and up. In terms of Gentiles coming to see the show, Fiddler, of course, is what really opened the doors to like the theater community at large coming to see our shows.
Yes. Let's see. It's this, and the themes. Most of the themes are the stories of the immigrants. Do you have immigrant families coming now? I know when Bubba Stories, a project I worked on, lots of people from other races said, "Oh, this Jewish musical, this is just like my life, or was like my life in Japan and Korea and other places around the globe."
Yes, we do a lot of outreach to engage with other immigrant groups. We had around the time we actually did a revival of the Golden Land in 2017 under the title America, the Golden Land, and we had a symposium called the Immigrant Arts Symposium or conference. I'm sorry, at that time, and we brought in speakers and panelists from the Pan-Asian Repertory Theater, from the Irish Repertory, from the Turkish American Theater, from Kairos, Italy, Italian Theater. And we've last year, in the fall, we actually found a script in a Yiddish translation of It Can't Happen Here, which had the anti-fascist play from the 1930s, which had been produced by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration theater. And they actually translated it into several languages, and it was performed simultaneously, I believe, by 19 theater companies around the country. This was in 1937, I believe. And so we found that script, and last fall we presented it in partnership. We each did a scene, so it was in English, Yiddish, Spanish, Italian, Turkish.
Oh my goodness.
And I might be missing one language, but it was phenomenal. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, that one couldn't be archived. When we do shows that have Actors Equity members, we're only allowed to keep it online for viewing for 4 days, and then it has to go away. So it's unfortunately not in the archives, but it was a landmark moment.
Oh my, I think you should reprieve that. That's not, as a matter of fact, we did that same play at the National Arts Club 4 or 5 years ago. So it was a theme that was running rampant through people's minds. They wanted to see it again.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Someone asked, could you please say again the names of the Abbott and Costello actors?
Oh, Gigon and Schumacher. And they've made dozens of recordings. You can find, again, a lot of it on, if you just YouTube Gigon, Dzigan. I'll put that in the chat for everybody.
And also, people asked, they would like some of your have copies of your pictures that you showed us, the woodcuts and some.
You can Google it and you'll find them. If you just look for Purim woodcut, most of this stuff is available out there.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Workmen's Circle? I am only aware of it as an organization that offers plots for cemeteries.
That's all I knew about it also, until I was in my late 20s, because my grandparents and my great-grandparents are buried in the Workers' Circle Cemetery. They're now, by the way, they renamed as the Workers' Circle to be gender neutral. In Yiddish, Arbeiter Ring. But they have all this while, they're an organization that is 120, now 2 years old. They were founded in 1900 as an immigrant aid society to provide benefits and fellowship for workers, as well as advocacy and health insurance and things like that. And they have a summer camp called Camp Kinderring that's still active. They have a network of secular Yiddish-inflected Jewish schools called shulas. So it's an alternative to Hebrew school. They have one in Manhattan, one in Westchester, one in Chicago, one in Brooklyn. And they offer online Yiddish classes. Go to circle.org. There are, I think they're now up to like 40 different Yiddish classes, all taught online with
my God,
hundreds of students. Every summer they run a Yiddish retreat where I teach a Yiddish theater workshop called A Trip to Yiddish Land. That's up at the summer camp after the kids leave in August. It's a remarkable organization, and they were our home for 90 some years.
Wow. Thank you.
80, sorry, not 90, 80, 1915 to 1998.
Now, the Henry Street Settlement House.
Yes.
Was that also another place in which Yiddish theater, or was that American?
Yes. No. In fact, we found records that some of the Folksbiene's earliest performances were at the theater, now the Abrams Arts Center, but were in that theater where in the Henry Street settlement. Also, a number of our early performances were in where Repertorio Español is now located. But we're talking like way back in the teens and early 20s. For the most amount of the Folksbiene's history, we were actually at a theater in the Forward Building down on East Broadway. Yeah, that's where the Worker Circle was headquartered. They shared the building with the Forward. And then for several years, we were at the Central Synagogue, and then we were kind of wandering homeless one year.
Weren't you at Baruch?
Yes, we were at the JCC in Manhattan. Then we were at Baruch for 6 years, and now, thankfully, we're at the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
You sound like a wandering tribe of theater.
In fact, we are. Yes.
That could be your subtitle.
Yes, we've never owned our own theater.
You have a desire to?
Sure, that's a dream to have a permanent, but then you have to figure out how to fill it all year round. But that's a good challenge to have. That's in our group. But we're very happy now partnering. It's not only a beautiful theater and performance space, but to be there with a front row view of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island to remind us where we come from and what our mission is. It's so inspiring. It's a great organization to partner with.
Yes, I recently saw Becoming Dr. Ruth with Tova Feldshuh, and the theater was absolutely magnificent. And I was thinking when you were talking about the ways in which you could do translation, you know, the Metropolitan Opera has in front of you a seat in which the words come up, so you don't have to look at a screen, and you
Yes.
don't have to read, and it's right there in front of you, eyes view. And I was thinking maybe they could do it because
Yes.
of who they are.
Repertorio Español has a system like that. They're the only other theater other than the Metropolitan Opera that I know of that has it. It is a significant investment. If anybody viewing wants to consider
Donate.
sponsoring
Yes.
the technological investment to make that possible, especially at that theater, because it would open up the world not only to the Yiddish theater, but you could have Hebrew language productions there and Ladino, and any language you can think of in which important work has been written.
Yes, that sounds absolutely perfect for that place.
I want to answer a question that popped up in the chat a moment ago. Somebody asked if we accept interns. We do have an internship program. It has been suspended due to COVID. We will be resuming in the fall. Somebody just asked about the Joe Papp Yiddish Theater. Yes, Joseph Paparovsky, founder of the Public Theater, was a native Yiddish speaker, and towards the end in the 1990s, possibly the late 80s, I'm not sure what year they started, there was a brief period at the Public where they were producing Yiddish theater, including the debut of Songs of Paradise. That was one of the posters that I showed you before. They are sort of starting up again now. Avi Hoffman, who is son of Professor Miriam Hoffman, who's now in Florida, is starting to reestablish a Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater in Florida. We welcome Yiddish theater wherever and however it establishes itself. There's new amateur groups all over the world, in Australia, in Paris. Students are taking on Yiddish productions. There was a fabulous animated production of a children's story called Lobzik, which came out of Emory University in Atlanta this year. More and more Yiddish content. Go to YouTube. All you have to do is put in the word Yiddish, and you're just going to see thousands and thousands and thousands of things that people have created. Somebody asked in the chat about Five-ish Finkel, my very dear friend. I had the privilege of directing Five-ish's last off-Broadway show, Five-ish Finkel Live, in 2011. That was also a Drama Desk Award nominated show for musical review.
I've been asked.
Real quick. I miss Five-ish each and every day.
Oh, well, we're hoping we have to begin to stop now. We have one more question, but we're hoping that maybe sometime you and the National Arts Club, through the theater committee, we might be able to do a reading with you or something, because our theater audience loves theater and would love what you bring.
We've actually performed a little bit there before. We've actually performed at the Arts Club, but it was for the Theater for the New Cities Gala a few years ago. Beautiful venue. You feel the history when you walk in. And speaking of Theater for the New City, yes, there's a Yiddish production about to open called Die Freuen, the Women. There has been a partnership between the New Yiddish Repertory Theater and the Theater for the New City for the last few years. Again, we're very happy. The more Yiddish theater there is in the world, the better it is for all of us.
And on that note, we thank you, Shalom, and we're going to come to your theater.
Please do. See Finzi Contini, see Harmony, and
please
definitely help support us.
Yes, thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful evening.
Thank you so much.